Hey guys, it's Steve from WireCare. You already know heat shrink is an amazing product that shrinks when heated to connect, insulate, reinforce, color code, and it gives a finishing touch to your wires and cables. You can use it for a lot of applications, from automotive to audio and video to communications and much more. But do you know how to measure it for the right fit? If not, today we're going to show you how it's done. Don't expect just because your heat shrink tubing is larger, it will shrink properly over your wires and cables. If it's not the right size, heat shrink can fall off and won't function as intended. You can measure your cable or wire's diameter with some common tools you likely have around: a caliper, a tape measure, or a ruler. With a caliper, expand the measuring jaw around each side of your wire or cable's end. Then close the jaw around it to measure its thinnest section. If your cable is not uniformly sized, measure at its widest point. With a tape measure or ruler, place your wire or cable against it to find its diameter. Is there a connector on the end of your wire or cable? Measure that at its widest point where you plan to shrink over it. For example, a connector may have several wide spots. But if you are not going to shrink over them, those places won't matter unless it's pre-assembled, in which case you'll need the shrink to be big enough to slide over the widest parts. If it is not pre-assembled, you'll need it to accommodate the widest area where you plan to add heat shrink. Then take the largest diameter of all the numbers you've recorded to determine the heat shrink size you need. This is the diameter you'll need to accommodate the heat shrink tubing, which should be able to slide over your connector and then shrink tightly onto your wire. If the largest diameter of your assembly is 1.5 inches, you'll want a heat shrink tubing size with an expanded inner diameter that slightly exceeds 1.5 inches, so you can slip it over the largest part of your assembly. Make note of the smaller wires or cables, which will help determine the shrink ratio you'll need. You'll also need to ensure you have enough heat shrink length for the section of wire or cable you plan on covering, because your tubing length can slightly shrink too. Next, choose your shrink ratio, which is what your tubing shrinks to after it's heated. The higher your ratio's first number, the more it shrinks. 2-to-1 ratio shrinks to half of its preheated size. 3-to-1 ratio shrinks to 1/3. 4-to-1 shrinks to 1/4. Heat shrink ratio is important because it provides that your heat shrink tubing has an expanded inner diameter that can cover your cable and connector, but can adequately shrink down to the smallest portion of your assembly. The ratio influences how tightly the tubing shrinks to these items. If you need to cover an inner splice, for example, you may only need 2-to-1, as it would most likely be a standard uniform shape. However, if you are covering a small harness of wires with a plug, you'll need to determine the difference between them to decide on the shrink ratio needed. A higher ratio can also create a thicker and better electrical insulation. Let's say you have an assembly that has a 1-inch plug and a 1/2-inch wire bundle. You can use a 1-inch diameter piece of heat shrink tubing with a 2-to-1 shrink ratio. It will shrink to half of its size to properly cover the wire. Now, if you have a 1-inch plug and a 3/8-inch wire, this is also where you would use a piece of 1-inch diameter heat shrink tubing, but you would need one with a 3-to-1 shrink ratio because you need the heat shrink to shrink down to 1/3 of the plug size. Then, if you have a 1-inch plug and a 1/4-inch wire, you'll need a 1-inch diameter piece of heat shrink, but with a 4-to-1 ratio to shrink down 1/4 of the plug size. If you have an assembly that is pre-assembled, even if the heat shrink isn't covering the widest part, be sure to order a bigger size heat shrink with the appropriate ratio to shrink all the way down to the assembly's smallest size. The heat shrink tubing should be slightly larger than the plugs it needs to slide over, but with a shrink ratio that can shrink and provide a tight seal down to the size of your wires or cables. Now that you know how to measure heat shrink, what are you waiting for? Links to the heat shrink products we've talked about are in the video description below. For more tutorials and videos, check out WireCare University on our YouTube page. Thanks for watching and see you next time.